Hi, James.
Hello.
And hello to everyone who is tuning in. My name is Amanda Little. I am a professor of journalism and science writing at Vanderbilt University, and I've been writing about climate change for many decades. And I'm delighted to speak with James Hogan, and I am going to turn it over to you, first of all, James, to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, well, I'm a business guy. I've owned a public relations agency for about 35 years. And in around 2005, I was asked onto a board of a big environmental group in Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation, and learned more than I really wish I knew about climate change, and became really interested in all of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns around climate change. And so I started a blog called Desmog Blog that became very popular kind of overnight. Wrote a book called Climate Cover Up that looked at the state of public discourse. And then another book called I'm Right and You're an Idiot that sort of looked at the polarization problem in public discourse. And so I'm someone who's become kind of fascinated by the pollution in public discourse.
Well, it's an amazing depth of knowledge that you have on an important topic, and it's personally relevant to me for many reasons. One is the fact that I live in the American South, in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have neighbors and family members who continue to resist what seems to my mind to be an overwhelming body of science on climate change. And I wonder if you can sort of help me understand the psychology of that resistance, the psychology of climate denialism. Let's just start there and then think about sort of how we can move through some of those barriers.
Yeah, well, so one of the big lessons that I've learned over the past 15 plus years that I've been writing about this is that facts don't change minds the way we think they do. And when I started Desmog Blog, I had this idea that all of this climate change denial and these fake scientists, kind of fake science, fake scientific reports, I mean, there's huge propaganda machine behind climate change denial in those days. And I remember as we were writing about it in Desmog Blog, how I was shocked. And these journalists who were working for me would come in with these stories and I'd say, what? You know, I couldn't even believe what they were telling me. And the more we looked into it, the worse it was, the more deception. And so I thought what we were doing was dealing with misinformation and actually disinformation, where you actually have people who are purposely trying to spread false information.
Yeah.
So anyway, we wrote for years and years, and then I published Climate Cover Up. And as I was going through this process, I learned a big lesson, and that's this, that misinformation is only a part of propaganda. And that's what makes propaganda so kind of fact resistant, and it makes the whole world of these kinds of ideological debates about whether or not climate change is real sort of fact free, fact resistant. And the reason for that is because it's one thing if I convince you that certain facts or certain false information is true.
Yeah.
That's a type of propaganda. But that's a lot of hard work when you're dealing with this massive amount of science. So it's better, and this is what propagandists learned, if I can convince you that this isn't something that people like us believe, and if you do believe this, you can't be one of us, you must be one of them, then I can get you to believe a whole bunch of false things because that's what your team believes. And there's a big social and economic cost to you changing your mind about those beliefs. And so that's where climate scientists got it wrong. And back in the day when I started Desmog Blog, it wasn't just that people were getting the facts and the science and the evidence wrong. It's that these climate scientists thought they were having a conversations with people's cerebral cortex, and when they
Mm,
were actually talking to their amygdala,
yeah.
where people feel threatened. And so it's not like you're having a conversation with somebody who's dumb. Where you're not talking to an idiot. You're not even necessarily talking to somebody who's stubborn. You're talking to someone who thinks you're threatening something that's very important to them, and that's the community that they belong to.
James, I'm going to have to borrow that and think very differently about how I talk to my neighbors and family members with whom I disagree, and realize I'm not talking to their cerebral cortex. I'm talking to their amygdala. That's very helpful. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about how I persuasively speak to their amygdala later, but let's go back into the history a little bit. In a recent World War Zero op-ed, Richard Stengel refers to the deep history of climate disinformation. And he says that, there are 50 years of strategies and tactics around this kind of, denialist propaganda. It's a very deep history. The Union of Concerned Scientists has, a deep record of fossil fuel companies distorting information around climate change, again, over so many decades. Can you speak to this and kind of tell me a little bit about this deep history of disinformation?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, that's what Desmogblog is about. And if you looked at it, you would be shocked. We have a deniers database of organizations and scientists who have been involved in climate change misinformation campaigns. And there are literally hundreds of people and organizations that have been heavily involved in this over a number of years. And it goes, as he says, it goes back 3 or 4 decades as far as we were able to see. And but again, that sort of trickiness of all this was, and something that was a big epiphany for me was, as I was watching the way they sort of spread misinformation, it wasn't that they weren't lying or that they weren't spreading false information, but what I finally learned was that what gave it the energy, what was really at the heart of this propaganda effort, was tribalism.
Mm.
Convincing people that this is a liberal idea, or this is like a big government, this is basically these guys trying to stick their foot in the door so that they can get more regulations and have government telling you what you should do.
Yeah.
And so climate scientists, they're basically out there talking about the climate science. These folks are listening to other people who are telling them making arguments that have convinced them that they're under threat, that they're under attack. There's a very interesting fellow at Yale Law School. His name is Dan Kahan. And he started a group called the Cultural Cognition Project, which is made up of social scientists around the United States. And what they do is they study this thing called cultural cognition, which is basically this social psychology phenomenon where when something comes along that contradicts the beliefs of the group that I belong to, that I tend not to change the beliefs, but I change the information to suit my beliefs. And I become kind of resistant to information that contradicts the beliefs and the values of my group. Right. And if someone persists in trying to, whether it's by more facts or more information or more science, in trying to change my mind, I actually double down and become more resistant. And so this is something, to go back to your original question, this is something that anyone who has like a grumpy old uncle who's had a few many beers at Thanksgiving and is a climate change denier has experienced, that they become, the more information that you provide, the more people double down and dig in. And it's because they feel threatened.
So tell me about that interaction with that uncle having had a few too many beers. What would be the effective way to speak to their amygdala? to sort of pull them out of the fight or flight mode. Obviously hurling, facts and statistics at them is not going to work. What does work to unwind that psychology?
Yeah, and that is like like a hugely complicated question. But let me give you a few insights into it, and these are things I've learned from the people I interviewed for my books. One of the people was a Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, and he's written 100 books, and he's an environmentalist as well as a famous Buddhist meditation teacher. So David Suzuki and I sat down with him and had tea at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I was talking to him about activism and environmentalism and climate change. And he was basically, he looked at David and I and he said, you don't have to tell people, you don't have to keep telling people that they're destroying the planet. They know they're destroying the planet. You need to deal with the despair. And in order to be good at dealing with the despair, you need to work on your own, the health of your own inner ecology. And so I thought, is he saying we should just like shut up and go meditate someplace, right? And so I said, you're not saying that David Suzuki shouldn't be an activist, are you? And he looked at me and he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. Speak the truth, but not to punish. And I felt like somebody had like punched me in the solar plexus. I mean, that was so shocking to me. It was so concise. This idea that we have to be really careful if we want to persuade someone who is dead set against believing what it is we're trying to tell them. We have to be very careful of those kind of intentions, those frustrations, the sort of emotional kind of dialogue that takes place in these things. And I think that there's a woman in California who does a really good job of training people to do this. Her name is Karen Tamaris. She has a group called Smart Politics. She's a psychiatrist from New York. And she basically trains people in exactly this, how to have a conversation with your grumpy uncle. And without going into the details of it, one of the fundamental lessons in what she teaches is that you need to basically have the common ground where you have found something that is in both of your interests before you start the disagreement.
Sure.
And what ends up happening most of the time is we go right to this whole thing about facts. And if you look at part of the psychology of it, there isn't a huge difference between somebody who is trying to make somebody else change their mind, who has facts on their side, and someone who's trying to make someone change their mind who has none.
Yeah.
I mean, self-righteousness can be just as sort of destructive to changing minds as denial, right? And so having this sort of emotional connection before, and the sense that, if you feel like, you may totally disagree with me, but if you feel like I actually have listened to you, that I actually got what you said, that I respected you enough to hear you, then it's easier for you and I to have a conversation, right? But when we're in that kind of amygdala state of mind, it's really difficult for the person who's wrong and the person who's right to actually find the place where you can have a conversation. And so
sorry to interrupt here, but how does the world of social media and the flow of information through blogging and microblogging change the game here? Because this all makes sense when you have humans interacting with humans. In that same op-ed that I referenced from Richard Stengel in World War Zero, he talks about a study by Brown University that was covered in The Guardian recently, which found that a quarter of the posts on climate change on Twitter were created by bots that had been programmed to promote climate denialism. Um, so I'm assuming those bots are digging right into the amygdala
Yeah.
and really activating those, and digging in further and further into those positions of denial. But how does that change the game here?
Yeah, so I think I think Facebook and Twitter and other and similar social media sites are kind of the steroids of this problem, and it's because the way that the information flow works is through these algorithms that rely on emotions that are very similar to the emotions that allow propaganda to confuse and divide people. So so hate, anger, those are like emotions that are very quick, and emotions that advertisers kind of like, because it engages you more, and it engages you more quickly. Compassion, love, friendliness, happiness, those are like slow, right?
Yeah.
And so these algorithms that are designed basically to sell advertising, and they sell you, they feed in certain kinds of information to you, whether it's in the form of news posts or advertising, that are divisive. And it's exactly the same as propaganda. And so it's kind of the worst possible thing that could have happened to us, is that we have social media. And weirdly, it was caused by good intentions. People wanted it to be open. They wanted it to be free. And so you basically have to pay for it somehow. So you get these advertisers essentially developing these algorithms that help them make money, that are basic. I think ultimately things are just going to continue to get worse unless you heavily regulate or change the financial models of Facebook and Twitter,
Yeah.
to be more like a public library, or to be more like Netflix or something, so that you're not almost demanding this divisive algorithm way of kind of manipulating people into hating each other.
Mm. So in another World War Zero op-ed recently, Curtis Houfland argues that the internet has been weaponized. And I think that's a term that seems consistent with what you're saying. Weaponized to spread extreme views on climate change. The propaganda is rooted in partial facts, preying upon pre-existing biases and distortions of public opinion. Do you think that that's a fair characterization, that this is really a kind of, I guess, appropriate, since we're on a platform that's using, terms of war, World War Zero, that this really is a sort of information war and in which the internet has been weaponized?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who actually understand how this works, and they really take advantage of it. And but I also think that in a way, the bigger problem, no one's kind of in charge of that. It's kind of just out of control. One of the guys that I interviewed for my book, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, was Peter Senge, who teaches in the business school at MIT. And he said that when he started he's like a systems guru. And I think he was going to school, and he was going to become a nuclear physicist. And then he became really interested in social systems. And he was maybe 21 or something. And he came to this realization that one of the big problems with the world is that humans have created these systems that they're incapable of managing. And I think this is one of I think these social media sites and these algorithms are just that these are extremely destructive, especially because there's got to be some relationship between the quality of public discourse and our ability to actually disagree constructively and public policy, and that is being severely interrupted by convincing people that false things are true. But it's worse than that, because I think these algorithms and these propaganda techniques have basically convinced people that there aren't any facts, that there's no such thing as evidence, that everybody's biased and we're all just in it for ourselves. And there's nobody who's really objective, right? And these algorithms help that. They reinforce those views, which basically it pollutes the public square and makes it so toxic that bad public policy and ideological kind of interference with reality is just inevitable.
So we've lost the ability to agree to disagree or disagree constructively, which is fundamental to a healthy democracy or a functioning democracy. And you've articulated that in a really interesting way. What about the ways in which the internet can be used to build consensus, to promote what may, or may not be considered, depending on who you are, positive propaganda on, possibility, consensus building around, for example, the Green New Deal, right? That is, a vision for solution and change and consensus building, in theory anyway. And we certainly see the rising generation of young climate activists using the internet, and in particular social media, blogging and microblogging platforms, to try and build consensus around positive, progress and solutions to climate change.
Right.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think that's the good part. And that, I think, was the original intention behind the people who developed it.
Yeah.
And that's why it was free. It was because it was seen as the future of democracy. And I think it's the financial model that undermines that. And so if you had a different financial model that didn't incentivize these divisive algorithms and that model, then I think that it could be a better thing. So I'm not for shutting it down, but I think it needs to be changed. And I know that's a big thing to ask, but I do think that's the problem. There was one person I talked to who told me about this study that was done in Germany, where they looked at the amount of racism in small communities, kind of anti-immigration racism, and found that it was correlated with Facebook use. So the more people in a community use Facebook, the more anti-immigration, when all those people were coming from North Africa into Europe, that's when they did the study, right? So there is a kind of a, you can't, it's for sure, it builds movements, it builds knowledge, it builds, one of the things I'm noticing these days is I'm actually making friends on Facebook, which I never thought you could actually do that, but because of all the kind of isolation, I've developed close relationships with certain people. So that's a very positive thing. We share information and chat about things. And so I think there's a lot of good, but I think there's probably way more bad.
I want to think about how we can sort of fight back against the divisive algorithms. But before we do that, I'm curious, given your depth of knowledge around propaganda and, particularly as it relates to climate change, what's your take on the Green New Deal as a piece of positive propaganda or positive messaging on climate change? I mean, it had been very effective, in terms of garnering a lot of media coverage and a lot of play in social media and on the internet. What do you think about that as a sort of with this framing of effective propaganda?
Yeah, and so I think that ultimately the path forward, part of the path forward out of this division, is storytelling and narrative that brings people together.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of an effort to do that. but how it's actually communicated is fundamental to whether or not it actually works. And I'm not saying communication in the sense of, how clearly do you explain it? How much information do you get out about it? It's not in volume of information that the solution lies. It's more in the nature of the stories and whether or not the stories are pluralistic enough so that you can avoid the polarization that climate change has suffered from, right? So there's this, in fact, the fellow, the Roger Connor that I just told you about, he wrote this amazing piece called The Advocacy Trap that is kind of informative to this. And in The Advocacy Trap, he basically says this, that if I take a position on something and I start to communicate it and you challenge me and I then try to correct you and make sure you have the information that you need to sort of think straight about what it was I was actually trying to say, and then you come back and criticize me again, I start to question you, and I start to think, maybe she's up to something. Maybe she's not just wrong. Maybe she's actually a wrongdoer. And maybe this isn't like a disagreement about something. Maybe this is more of a battle. And so the advocacy trap is when we don't realize that people can be dead wrong about something and still be a good person, we are more apt to fall into this trap of good versus evil. So you can be on the right side of an issue and then somebody can be disagreeing with you, and you can bring this the amygdala part of this story, a way of looking at this, into the conversation and get you treating that person as an enemy, and then they start treating you as an enemy. And then after a while, even though you're on the right side of things and you have the good strategies, and you've missed the opportunity to create common ground with that person, and you're basically in this trap, the trap door is slammed shut, and you're more interested in beating the other person than you were in the original issue that you were working on. And so advocates, I think, have to be aware that they too could be part of the problem, even if they're right about something. If they can't find a way, particularly in these highly polarized times, of finding places where we can have conversations and the other person can feel like they're respected, even if you disagree with them. And so I think that the Green New Deal is just like anything else. If you allow the bad guys who are doing this kind of disinformation propaganda to drag these issues into that, and you're not skilled at dragging it back out again, then you lose. So I think a lot of the future of the environmental movement and of the climate change movement lies in our ability to tell our own story.
Okay, that's a perfect segue into back into this op-ed by Curtis Hoffland that had a really interesting proposal, I thought. He argues for, and I'm just going to read a brief passage from it, a new kind of climate movement relying on the synchronization of highly personal, emotional, and visual peer-to-peer content at unprecedented speed and scale. He says that the first step in this movement is to continuously map opportunities and risks emerging in the discourse online through machine intelligence, and take sort of data around climate and recent climate news, package it into briefs, and share that across a network of messengers. These messengers would be matched to audiences who need to be persuaded across locations, professions, ages, races, genders, and the ideological spectrum. And so he says, one message, thousands of stories. And it seems like that is consistent with your sort of, with what you're saying, the importance of pluralism in storytelling, but also probably continuity in message. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think it is I'm a big fan of Marshall Gantz, who teaches public narrative at Harvard Kennedy School. And he, one of the things he says is that, powerful public narrative is a story of self, a story of us and a story of the kind of fierce urgency of now. And so I think keeping in mind, the reason I talked about all this kind of propaganda stuff and what's behind people's unreasonableness is because it makes it easier to understand why you would want to go out of your way to have this kind of narrative, this story of us narrative with somebody who looks so unreasonable, right? And so we want, I think, as advocates, to be able to tell our story, and not just my story, but you need to tell your story to account for why you're even talking to people. But I think it's also important to talk about our story in a way that I think these things are beyond marketing. So I think you have to be very careful that you don't use too much marketing techniques here. But I think deep storytelling stuff, the kind of stuff that Martin Luther King used, these sort of deep narratives that kind of move these cultural values along, and not allow people who oppose you the ground that they gain when you start getting ticked off at them because they drag you into this us versus them way of looking at things, right? Because that's the sort of propaganda trap that you have to avoid. Even though the other people are wrong and it feels good to think somebody's an idiot, it's not helpful in terms of the broader kind of narrative.
How important is it, you just invoked Martin Luther King, how important is it to focus on the dream, right? I mean, King built a movement on I have a dream, not I have a grievance. He was emphatically, optimistic and future forward. I mean, he was, of course, very realistic about pain and suffering, but really brought it back to the dream. And I wonder, I think that was certainly what motivated, the messaging around the Green New Deal. How important is it, to, when you're talking with, for example, the grumpy uncle, to really, sort of neutralize that overactive amygdala, the fight or flight, with a focus on, opportunity, dream, solutions, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what stage of the conversation you're in. But one of the things that happened when I was doing the interviews for my book was I had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And at the end of the interview, we were sort of standing up and they were turning off the cameras and everything. And he pointed at my forehead and he said, "We like to think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but in Tibet, we go with the heart." And I think sometimes that can be stronger. So maybe if we take the Western mind and the Tibetan heart together, then maybe we can fix some of these problems like climate change. And at first I just thought, well, what a lovely thing to say. And I know his message is, it's kind of cultivating the heart, the sort of power of compassion. But ultimately, the way that you connect with people emotionally, the way that you provide hope, the way that you create possibility is through stories. And it's through stories that are well told, personal, they're stories of the community. And so I think this is fundamental, but I think the storytelling of it is as important as the content. Because if the story is not well told, if it doesn't do the opposite of propaganda, which is to divide, so if it doesn't do the opposite, which is to draw people together, then the information doesn't move and people aren't convinced. And so to give meaning, you need emotion, and to create an emotional conversation, you need the story. And so I believe that we need to become better storytellers, less stiff. We have great storytellers. Michelle Obama is an amazing storyteller. Barack Obama. I mean, these people are people that all of us should be trying to learn those skills from. I don't personally, after dealing with environmentalists for the last 15 years, since the early 2000s, I wasn't much of an environment person until then. Most environmentalists are really terrible storytellers. I mean, some of them are good, but some of them, you know, they don't make people feel hopeful. They make people feel guilty, or they make them feel bad, right? So hope is good. Hope is the counterbalance to fear and anger and all those other divisive kinds of emotions that propaganda stirs up.
Yeah, the story that has resonated so powerfully in recent years, certainly, particularly among youth climate activists, but globally, is the story of Greta Thunberg and the way she's conveyed it. And it certainly hasn't been all rosy, dream focused commentary. A lot of it has been about her outrage and her anger and yet the way in which she's conveyed that sort of combination of outrage and hope has been very effective. Can you comment on that? Why do you think her story is resonating, and sort of more broadly about the way in which this rising generation of youth climate activists are becoming more sophisticated in their messaging and storytelling around climate change?
Yeah, so I think she would be. I don't know if she's ever heard of Marshall Gantz. I have no idea, but she would be like a poster child for the Marshall Gantz model of public narrative, because she has such a powerful personal story, and she has the kind of a story that kind of touches us, right? It touches a lot of people. It doesn't seem kind of fakey. It doesn't seem packaged. It doesn't. It seems authentic, But I don't want to go too far down that authentic road. But it's more just in my mind, the kind of deep emotional conversation that she has with people, and it's not always nice. I mean, she's talking about something that's terrible. She's not saying we should just go change our light bulbs, right? It's bigger. This is like you got the whole idea of a young child talking about the end of life on Earth as we know it. Just that story itself is so powerful and moving. I think it's hard to listen to her and not be touched. And I think so. It's just that simple. That's what I think we need more of. Is people digging into themselves, understanding their own, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, their own inner ecology, so that they can be better kind of warriors for the environment.
And I think there's something that strikes a lot of people on all political persuasions as too facile, too inauthentic, when the message is too positive. Hey, we're gonna climate change is the biggest job creation engine of our time. We can fix this and fix the economy, and it's all positive messaging. That tends to fall short, I think, for a lot of people. That there has to be a moral imperative that's invoked. There has to be a real sense of pragmatism, a sense of loss, alongside the possible progress that can be made. So there's a complexity to the way that Greta Thunberg is telling her story, that is, again, not overly simplified, and which then smacks of it rings false. Her story, to many people, and certainly there are plenty of people to whom her story does not ring true, but it has dimension. And that dimension is important in terms of actually persuading and changing minds. What Any other comments on the kind of rise of the youth climate movement, and the way that they are using online tools or offline tools to change propaganda and messaging on climate change? It's such an important moment right now. I mean, we really have the new guard taking over, and moving beyond the old guard in the climate movement and environmentalism more broadly. I'm curious about your take on that, because you've said that you've worked with a lot of environmentalists and they don't really get storytelling But it seems to me that this, new generation of climate activists is much savvier when it comes to effective storytelling.
Yeah, and I think like one way I look at the world now is as stories, right? So as a narrative. So we have this collective narrative about the environment and about climate change that has been created by all the people who've kind of participated in the disputes over the last number of decades. And what ends up happening is it ends up becoming kind of calcified. It takes on a shape that can't be changed. So people try and change it, but it's sort of solidified, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that just by their youth and by their freshness, they are changing things. And you see somebody like Greta, and I think one of the things about somebody like her, and I'm not exactly sure what it is about her, but I think people see some of themselves in her. Just the fact that she can be so kind of rude in some ways, and outspoken and strong of voice at the same, you know what I mean? She just has a range that I think people can identify with, right? And I think that helps to kind of take away some of this calcified way, because I think that's what needs to happen, that we've allowed, whether we're advocates or opponents of, doing something about climate change, we have allowed the narrative to move to a place where it kind of spins. It's not moving forward, and there's such a big difference between the public narrative of climate change and what's actually happening with climate change that we really have to take some responsibility for. And I think these young people see that. They're frightened and alarmed, and they're going to try things, and boy, I sure wish them luck. And I would be the last person on earth who would try to sort of advise them on what they should do, because I sort of feel like I've been part of the group before that didn't do as well as it should have.
And I think that Greta Thunberg has said repeatedly that her story doesn't actually resonate with particularly, the non-white progressive audiences that have many stories to tell on their own. That she feels that her story has become kind of a tyranny of a single story in its way, and that it needs to be diversified, and it needs to show so many of the other, local stories that are emerging. And so that speaks to, that pluralistic sort of multiplicity of voices that need to emerge. And that may be what's coming is, a more opportunity to elevate the tens of thousands of Greta Thunbergs that are in, and those voices that are in, every state, every country, etc. And move beyond that. Now, we only have a couple more minutes left. And so I want to end by asking you as a PR executive, if you were to be advising the Biden campaign on how to build their message on climate change and weave it into their platform, and what should their sort of climate propaganda in the positive sense look like over the next 3 months, what would your advice be?
Well, yeah, again, another huge, huge question. With that type of political narrative around an issue like that, I'm a big believer in doing really deep research and, looking at the kind of work that's been done at Yale with Six Americas and that type of research, because I think that, again, you have this us versus them meaning that has been pasted onto climate change. And so the question becomes, how do you take it off? How do you make climate change about me? And I know that over the years, I've seen these scientific reports in the States where you do these reports on the climate impacts locally. And I think I think climate is a local issue for a lot of people. Like, what is it doing to me if I live in the Florida Keys is different than what it might do to me, if I live in the Midwest. And so I think trying to actually shape the narrative so that it's about the area that you're talking to. It's harder to have the broader kind of conversation. I think for me, I would be really, you want to make, you want to work hard at trying to diffuse the polarization. And the best way to do that is to be talking about climate change as, about what you can do about climate change in a way that benefits certain local communities. And I know, I've got a friend who's done a lot of work in Florida, and you can work beyond right and left if you're trying to stop flooding neighborhoods. You don't even use the word climate change, right? So you need to explore those kinds of things to move beyond the polarization. Sorry, I can't give you more than that, but.
Well, I think that it actually comes full circle, because what you've said is, we have to think about the importance of hyper-local, hyper-personal storytelling. And, we heard, that passage earlier in our conversation from Curtis Hoffland in his World War Zero op-ed. One message, thousands of stories, and that can shape the way we think about how we move through that this deep divide in the way we're thinking about climate. James, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you
so much.
And pleasure, but also very provocative. I have a lot to think about, and all those references I'm going to have a lot to read. So thank you for your time and your insights, and all the best